The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany dining table as Margaret Chen adjusted her simple black dress one last time before entering the grand dining room of her son's estate. At 72, she carried herself with quiet dignity, despite the modest clothing that marked her as different from the opulent surroundings. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, her son David's promotion to senior partner at his law firm, but the air crackled with an underlying tension she couldn't quite place. According to YouTube analytics, 99.3% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. David had moved into this mansion just 2 years ago, after marrying Victoria Ashford, heiress to a pharmaceutical fortune. Margaret had raised David alone after her husband died when the boy was only 8, working 3 jobs to put him through law school. She'd sacrificed everything, her own dreams, her health, her modest savings, to give him the education that led to this success. "Mother, you made it," David said, approaching with a strained smile. His embrace felt perfunctory, lacking the warmth she remembered from their weekly dinners before his marriage. "I wouldn't miss celebrating your success, darling," Margaret replied, noting how his expensive suit made her second-hand dress feel even more out of place. "I'm so proud of what you've accomplished." Victoria glided over in a shimmering silver gown that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly pension. Her smile was perfectly practiced, never reaching her cold blue eyes. "Margaret, how quaint. You look exactly as I expected." The backhanded compliment stung, but Margaret had endured worse. She'd learned to navigate these social minefields since David's marriage, always feeling like an unwelcome intruder in her own son's life. The other guests were Victoria's crowd, wealthy socialites, business partners, and political connections. Margaret recognized none of them, and from their dismissive glances, they found her presence equally puzzling. She took her seat at the far end of the table as far from the head as possible, feeling increasingly invisible. Throughout the first course, conversation flowed around topics Margaret couldn't contribute to: European vacations, yacht clubs, private school recommendations for children she didn't know existed. David seemed to have forgotten she was there, laughing at Victoria's stories about their recent trip to Monaco, a trip Margaret had learned about through social media rather than from her son directly. When the main course arrived, a dish she couldn't pronounce with ingredients she'd never heard of, Margaret tried to engage with the woman beside her, asking politely about her work. The woman looked at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language before turning away with obvious disdain. "Excuse me," Margaret said softly to the server. "Could I possibly get a glass of water? I seem to have finished mine." Before the server could respond, Victoria's voice cut across the table like a blade. "Oh, for heaven's sake." She turned to Margaret with theatrical exasperation. "Mother Margaret, this isn't a roadside diner. The staff isn't here to cater to every little request." The table fell silent. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "I apologize. I didn't mean to." No, this has gone on long enough," Victoria interrupted, her voice growing louder and more theatrical. She gestured dramatically to the security guard stationed discreetly in the corner, a precaution, she'd explained earlier, for such valuable gatherings. "Security! Get this pauper away from the table. She's disrupting our celebration with her inappropriate behavior." The room erupted in uncomfortable murmurs. Margaret felt the world tilt around her. Her own son's wife had just called her a pauper and ordered security to remove her. She looked desperately to David, waiting for him to defend her, to stand up and say this was unacceptable. David cleared his throat, his face flushed with embarrassment, but instead of defending his mother, he avoided her eyes entirely. Perhaps it would be best if Mother went home. She seems a bit overwhelmed by all this," The betrayal hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her son, the boy she'd raised alone, worked herself to exhaustion for, sacrificed everything to educate, was siding with his wife. He was allowing her to be humiliated and removed like an unwanted vagrant. "Ma'am," the security guard said gently, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, "if you could please come with me." Margaret rose on unsteady legs, her dignity intact despite the crushing humiliation. She looked once more at her son, hoping to see some flicker of the boy who used to tell her she was his hero. But David was studying his wineglass as if it held the secrets of the universe. "Of course," Margaret said quietly. "I apologize for any disruption." As she walked toward the door, she heard Victoria's voice behind her, dripping with false sympathy. "It's such a shame when people can't accept their place in the world. Some people simply don't belong in refined society." The car ride home passed in a blur of tears and rage, but by the time Margaret reached her small apartment, the tears had stopped, replaced by something harder and more focused. She sat in her modest living room, surrounded by photographs of David through the years, graduation photos she'd scrimped to pay for, childhood memories of birthday parties she'd worked double shifts to afford. On her coffee table lay a stack of legal documents she'd been organizing, documents that would have shocked David and Victoria if they'd bothered to look beyond her simple appearance and modest lifestyle. Margaret Chen hadn't always been poor. 25 years ago, she'd been Margaret Blackwood, co-founder with her late husband of Blackwood Innovations, a small tech company that had developed crucial early internet security protocols. When her husband died, she'd sold her shares to focus on raising David, investing the money carefully but living simply to ensure his future was secure. The documents on her table represented the fruits of that careful investment: stock portfolios, real estate holdings, and most importantly, the patent rights to those early security protocols that had become industry standard. Margaret Chen was worth approximately $47 million. She'd hidden her wealth deliberately, wanting David to succeed on his own merits, to learn the value of hard work as she had. She'd planned to surprise him on his 40th birthday next month, to reveal that his children would never want for anything, that he could pursue his passion for pro bono work without financial worry. But David had made his choice. He'd chosen a woman who valued appearance over character, wealth over love. He'd chosen to humiliate the woman who'd given him everything. Margaret picked up her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. "Henderson, Class and Associates, Marcus Henderson speaking." "Marcus, it's Margaret. I need to schedule a meeting. It's time to execute Plan B." Marcus Henderson had been her financial advisor for 20 years, one of the few people who knew her true financial position. They'd discussed this contingency: what to do if David's character proved wanting, if wealth and status corrupted the values she'd tried to instill. "Are you certain, Margaret? Once we do this, there's no going back." Margaret looked at the photo on her mantel, David at his law school graduation, his arm around her, both of them glowing with pride and possibility. That young man seemed like a stranger now. "I'm certain. Tomorrow morning, begin the transfers." Over the next 3 days, Margaret worked systematically. She contacted the board of the charitable foundation she'd secretly funded for years, informing them of a major donation incoming. She reached out to her late husband's former business partner, now running a tech conglomerate, about purchasing certain patent rights. She made calls to real estate developers, university endowment funds, and investment managers. Most importantly, she contacted Victoria's father, Richard Ashford. "Mr. Ashford? This is Margaret Chen. I believe you know my son David, your daughter's husband." "Ah, yes, the young lawyer. Victoria mentioned you attended their dinner party. How can I help you?" "I have a business proposition that might interest you. I understand your pharmaceutical company has been struggling with cybersecurity issues." What Richard Ashford didn't know was that Margaret's early security protocols were exactly what his company needed, and that she was prepared to offer them a licensing deal worth millions, but only under very specific conditions. Meanwhile, David tried calling her twice, leaving awkward voicemails that danced around an apology without actually offering one. Margaret didn't return his calls. The plan came together with devastating precision. Marcus Henderson was nothing if not thorough, and Margaret's years of careful investment had given her influence in places Victoria and David never suspected. The first domino fell on Monday morning. David's law firm received a call from their largest client, Richard Ashford's pharmaceutical company, terminating their contract due to philosophical differences about family values. David called Margaret frantically that evening. "Mother, I don't understand what's happening. Victoria's father fired our firm. He mentioned something about family values. Did you... did something happen at the dinner?" Margaret let the question hang for a moment. "Did something happen? You allowed your wife to have me removed by security, David. You sat there while she called me a pauper and humiliated me in front of strangers. So yes, something happened. I'm sorry about that." Victoria was stressed about the party and, "Don't make excuses for cruelty, David. You made your choice." The second domino fell on Tuesday. Victoria discovered that the exclusive charity board she'd been desperately trying to join had not only rejected her application, but had issued a statement about reviewing the character of potential members more carefully. The charity, it turned out, was one Margaret had been quietly funding for years. Wednesday brought the revelation that Victoria's trust fund, managed by the same investment firm Margaret used, was being restructured. Due to fiduciary concerns about the family's public behavior, certain investment options were no longer available, significantly reducing Victoria's monthly allowance. By Thursday, David was frantic. His career was crumbling, Victoria was having hysterics about her reduced circumstances, and he was beginning to suspect his mother's involvement. "Mother, please, can we talk? I'll come to you." "No need," Margaret replied calmly. "I'll be at Romano's restaurant tomorrow at 7. Come alone." Romano's was the small Italian place where she and David had celebrated every major milestone of his childhood: birthdays, graduations, scholarships. It seemed fitting for what she had to say. David arrived looking haggard, his usual confidence replaced by desperate confusion. He'd lost weight in just a week, and his expensive suit couldn't hide the stress etched in his features. "Mother, I don't understand what's happening. Everything's falling apart. Victoria thinks you're somehow behind it, but that's impossible. You don't have that kind of influence or money?" Margaret finished quietly. She slid a folder across the table. "Look inside." David's hands trembled as he opened the folder. His face went pale as he scanned the financial statements, property deeds, and investment portfolios. $47 million. His mother, who he'd watched scrimp and save throughout his childhood, who wore secondhand clothes and clipped coupons, was worth $47 million. "I don't understand. How is this possible? You worked 3 jobs just to pay for my school." "I worked 3 jobs because I chose to. Because I wanted you to understand the value of effort and sacrifice. This money came from the company your father and I built together. I've been growing it carefully for 25 years, planning to share it with you and your children when the time was right." David stared at the documents, understanding beginning to dawn. "When would the time have been right?" "Your 40th birthday next month. I was going to surprise you to tell you that you could pursue pro bono work without worry, that your children would be secure. I wanted to see what kind of man you'd become first." The weight of his betrayal settled on David's shoulders like a physical burden. "And what kind of man have I become?" Margaret met his eyes steadily. "The kind who allows his wife to humiliate his mother. The kind who chooses social status over loyalty. the kind who forgets where he came from. Mother, I'm sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry. I was weak, and I was wrong, and you were. But apologies don't undo choices, David. They don't erase the moment you decided I was an embarrassment to be managed rather than your mother to be honored. David broke down then, tears streaming down his face in the middle of the restaurant. Please, tell me how to fix this. Tell me what to do. Margaret felt her heart breaking even as she maintained her composure. This was still her son, still the boy she'd raised and loved. But he was also the man who had betrayed that love when it mattered most. The money I've been moving this week isn't gone, David. It's been redirected. Some to charities, some to educational funds, some to purchase assets that were being used against people like me, people who are judged by their appearance rather than their character. She pulled out another document. This is the deed to a small foundation I'm establishing. It provides legal aid to working-class families, educational scholarships to single-parent households, and support for elderly people facing discrimination. I'm funding it with $35 million. David's eyes widened. What about the rest? $5 million goes to your children's education funds, but only if they attend public school and learn what real diversity looks like. Another $5 million is in an account that you can access, but only for pro bono legal work helping people who can't afford representation. And the remaining $2 million? Margaret smiled sadly. That's for me to live comfortably while doing work that matters. I'm too old to keep pretending I'm poor, and too tired to keep hiding my truth for someone else's comfort. David sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what had happened. Finally, he looked up. What about Victoria? What about us? Victoria married a successful lawyer from a good family. If she can't love that man without the promise of inheritance money he never earned, then perhaps she's not the partner you thought she was. And if she leaves me? Then you'll know her true character, won't you? Just as I learned yours. The conversation stretched on for 2 hours. David begged for forgiveness, promised to change, swore he'd stand up to Victoria and anyone else who disrespected his mother. Margaret listened with the sadness of someone who had loved deeply and been profoundly disappointed. I love you, David. I will always love you. But love doesn't mean enabling bad behavior or accepting disrespect. I raised you to be better than what you showed me at that dinner. I can be better. I will be better. Perhaps. But trust is like fine china, darling. Once it's broken, you can glue it back together, but the cracks will always show. They parted that night with an embrace, but it felt different, sadder, more fragile than before. The aftermath unfolded predictably. Victoria, faced with reduced circumstances and a husband whose career was in shambles, filed for divorce within a month. She moved back to her father's house, claiming David had misrepresented his family's financial situation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the full story. David threw himself into pro bono work with the passion of someone seeking redemption. He took cases that reminded him of his childhood, helping working families fight predatory landlords, defending immigrants facing deportation, ensuring children in the system had proper legal representation. The work paid little, but the account Margaret had established meant he could focus on justice rather than billable hours. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the main hall of the community center that bore her late husband's name. The Blackwood Center for Family Justice provided free legal aid, financial literacy classes, and support services for families facing discrimination. David worked here 3 days a week, his expensive suits replaced with simple clothes that didn't intimidate the clients he served. Mrs. Chen? A young woman approached nervously. I'm Maria Santos. Your son helped my family keep our home. I just wanted to thank you. Margaret smiled warmly. Thank my son, dear. He's the one doing the work. He told me about you, though. About how you raised him to understand what it means to struggle. He said he lost his way for a while, but you helped him find it again. As Maria walked away, David approached his mother. Their relationship remained strained, built now on careful politeness and shared work rather than easy intimacy. The trust was rebuilding slowly, crack by careful crack. "Mother, there's something I need to tell you," David said quietly. "Victoria is getting remarried to a tech executive she met through her father." Margaret nodded. "I heard. Are you all right?" "I am. It's strange, but I'm grateful it happened. I think I married her for the wrong reasons, and she married me for reasons that had nothing to do with who I actually am." They stood in comfortable silence, watching families receive services that Margaret's money had made possible. Finally, David spoke again. "I know I can't undo what I did at that dinner. I can't take back choosing appearances over loyalty or letting someone I loved be humiliated while I did nothing. But I want you to know that I understand now what you tried to teach me." "What's that?" "That real wealth isn't about money or status or impressing people who don't matter. It's about character and integrity and standing up for the people who stood up for you." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, the first she'd allowed herself since that horrible dinner. "That's what I always hoped you'd learn. I'm sorry it took so long. And I'm sorry it took losing you to figure it out." Margaret reached for her son's hand, feeling the calluses that had developed from his work with struggling families. "You haven't lost me, David. But you did have to lose the version of me who would accept being treated as less than I am. I love this version of you better, the one who doesn't hide her strength or her worth, even if it cost you your marriage and your social status." David smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since before his wedding. "Especially because it cost me those things. They weren't worth having if they required betraying you." As the sun set over the community center, Margaret reflected on the strange turns life could take. She'd planned a quiet retirement, spoiling grandchildren and supporting her son's career from the shadows. Instead, at 72, she was running a foundation, living openly as the wealthy woman she'd always been, and learning that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to accept less than you deserve. The revenge she'd planned had morphed into something more complex, not just punishment, but education. Not just retribution, but restoration. David had learned who he really was when everything superficial was stripped away, and perhaps that lesson was worth more than any inheritance she could have left him. The scars remained, of course. Some dinners were still awkward, some conversations still careful. The easy trust of earlier years might never fully return. But what had emerged in its place was something more honest. A relationship built on mutual respect rather than just blood, on chosen loyalty rather than assumed obligation. Margaret Chen had gotten her revenge, but more importantly, she'd gotten her dignity back. And sometimes, in the complicated mathematics of family love, that equation balanced perfectly. In the end, the pauper Victoria had ordered removed from the table had taught them all something about true wealth and the price of betraying the people who love you most.